Hello everybody and welcome back to another piece of White Zulu. And this one I think is particularly entertaining as it's chapter 7, the Baboons. So here we go. In 1945, when she arrived at our ranch as a new bride, Mum got the Zulu women, wives of our resident staff, to dig a quarter of an acre of the rich dark soil behind the house and began growing vegetables. As the mealies grew silky tufts to their soft green ears, the baboon troop slipped silently in at dawn and wrenched the plants out, eating the mealies and trashing what was left. They also dug up her new potatoes and stripped the vines of pea pods. She was outraged, and Dad offered to fence the plot with strong chicken wire, including the top, to prevent any more such raids. For reasons best known to herself, Mum refused this offer, thinking, I suppose, that she wasn't going to let any baboons get the better of her. And for the next 60 years, the baboons led her a merry dance. When my great-grandfather bought the 5,000 acres in 1880, the baboons had already been there for centuries, millenniums. A troop of about 80 chacma baboons live in the rocky outcrops high in the hills and forage in the dense natural forests which carpet the hillsides of our valley, as you can see behind me in my picture. The baboons developed a strategy of stealth and, of course, had all day in which to monitor the house while Mum went about the business of creating a home. She started to get up even earlier in the morning than the baboons and lay in wait for them in the long grass behind her veggie patch with the 410 shotgun. Dad told her she'd never get a baboon with birdshot, but she proved him wrong. Early one morning in 1955, she somehow managed to tree half the troop. Several baboons were cowering high up in a pine tree, having pulled the branches around them for cover. She saw a grey paw reaching out to pull some more pine needles across to camouflage its fur, and she fired into the tree. A medium-sized baboon dropped out of the tree, having let go in fright, and fell heavily, breaking its neck instantly. Mum was thrilled. Delighted with her victory, she rang the local newspaper, the Natal Witness, who sent a reporter the hour-and-a-half journey from Pietermaritzburg on dirt roads to take a photograph of her wearing a blue cotton shirt, a denim skirt, and veldschoens, and holding the shotgun, triumphantly posed next to the dead baboon. She had the picture framed on her dressing table to the day my parents left, aged in their late 80s. One of my sisters has it now. The troop continued to plague her, though, and we were often woken at the crack of dawn by shotgun reports rending the still, tranquil dawn air and echoing around the valley. Mum had another goal: to exterminate the flocks of fluffy grey speckled mouse birds, izindlazi, which swooped in troops onto her Namaqualand daisies and nipped the buds off before they flowered. She'd lie in wait in their bedroom at dawn, elbows resting on the windowsill, and blast them as they settled, the noise causing us to leap from our beds in surprise. On meeting Mum, people saw her as a stunning, slender, blonde, blue-eyed beauty with exquisite manners which revealed her aristocratic background, a lady with a privileged upbringing. When the war broke out, she was in her early 20s, and because of her steely determination, Mum joined the Women's Auxiliary Force, Air Force, rose to the rank of Sergeant Major, and became an excellent shot. This same resolve was now directed to creating her version of a perfect home and an English country garden in the lovely valley, with the river a silver ribbon winding alongside the dark green forest. With her single-minded, obsessive passion, she planted fruit trees, ornamental cherry trees, and masses of shrubs, all of which bore ripe, succulent scarlet berries in the autumn. The baboons were drawn to this bounty, and every year, silently, like brown ghosts, they would creep into the garden and strip the fruit and berries off the trees, breaking off big branches, and often uprooting the bushes in their enthusiasm. We loved the baboons. I enjoyed watching them as they frolicked in the paddocks just beyond the garden and on the banks of the river that's behind me. They would graze happily on the ryegrass which Dad had sown for green winter feed for the livestock, pulling up great tufts of the sweet, juicy shoots and stuffing them into their cheek pouches. The baby baboons would jump and play while the adults gorged themselves. One or two of the older males sat on boulders and kept watch while the troop moved quietly along the peaceful valley. My sisters and I could choose whether to lie on the lawn, gazing at the tranquil scene unfolding below us, or have some sport. We would race across to where Mum was bent over in a flower border, weeds flying out behind her, along with a small cloud of dust and earth, and whisper, "Baboons in the paddock, Mum." The effect was immensely satisfying, as she'd rip off her gardening gloves, throw them onto the lawn, and run into the house for her gun. Quickly she'd load it with cartridges and then start her leopard crawl towards the may hedge, which shielded the garden from the paddocks. Slowly she'd rise to her feet, the gun to her shoulder. We'd always have a last-minute pang of conscience, and as Mum was about to squeeze the trigger, one of us would manufacture a loud sneeze to warn the troop. The startled baboons would scatter in all directions, and with loud warning barks amid shrieks of terror, scamper as fast as they could into the depths of the forest. Mum would lower her weapon and round on us as we prepared to melt away with the same alacrity as our primate cousins had. "Why did you have to scare them off?" she'd demand indignantly. "I could have got one." "Susanna, did you see the baboons this morning?" Mackay, our Zulu houseboy, would ask conversationally as he was taking away the breakfast dishes. "They were down in the paddock there," and he pointed out towards the river. "I saw them pulling up and eating the new ryegrass shoots Nkosan, Dad, literally chief's son, planted for the cattle." He paused and started to cackle, shaking his head ruefully. "Then your mother saw them, and she shouted for the dogs to chase them. Those dogs—" By now he had both hands on his bent knees, he was laughing so much. "They were barking, and they ran down and chased the baboons off. Fast, right into the bush." He was gasping for breath between gales of laughter as he demonstrated the scene with both hands. With his left, he depicted baboons running along by galloping his black fingers, chased by his right hand paddling the air to represent our dogs in pursuit, all accompanied by the caterwauling noise he made in his expert mimicry of terrified, shrieking baboons. Even your dog Pitts, that dog, small as he is, was out in front chasing those baboons. Mackay stood for a minute, shaking his head and clicking his tongue in admiration. None of our farm staff ever got over the discrepancy between the size of Pitts and his capacity for bravery, or, more to the point, recklessness. Mackay put his hands down, picked up the big wicker tray again, and still, chuckling with mirth, made his way slowly and rather reluctantly back to the kitchen. I loved these interludes. I got as much pleasure out of the baboons' antics as the Zulus did, especially Mackay, and always enjoyed his imitation of their behavior, copied from his years of covertly watching them when he was outside doing chores, such as fetching firewood from the sawmill or collecting veggies from our garden. Grandpa had been aware of the baboon's nuisance value as soon as he first settled and started grazing sheep on the farm. To supplement the sparse winter grazing, he would put troughs in the paddocks and fill them with mealie kernels. Immediately, the troop started raiding, eating all the mealies as soon as they were put there. Grandpa employed umfans, small boys, Zulus, to stand guard over the troughs and throw stones at the baboons to chase them off, and so allow the sheep to eat their fill each day. This system worked well enough until Grandpa was at a stock stale in our nearest village, Nottingham Road, and while comparing notes with other farmers, was told by an old Afrikaner Boer that there's a simple way to rid any farm of baboons. You build a trap and bait it with ears of mealies, and when you've caught a baboon, you paint it white and release it again. The baboon would race off to join its troop, but the rest of the animals would run away from it the rest of the animals would run away from it as they wouldn't recognize it as one of them. Thus, the entire troop would just keep on running off the farm and into the Drakensberg Mountains, never to be seen again. So, Grandpa built a sturdy baboon trap out of strong timber, right near the edge of the bush, alongside the river, where they were often seen foraging for food. It had a gate which dropped down firmly once the mealies were disturbed, but all he ever caught was guinea fowl, who were also partial to mealie kernels. Many years later, Mum developed her own version of the baboon trap. This was a big wire cage from an old bakkie, which was used to take sheep to the stockyards, propped up on bricks on one side. This contraption was placed carefully just outside a mud hut at the edge of the staff kraal, home to Matthias, our Zulu tractor driver. He was to bait the trap with mealies last thing at night, and then lie hidden on his bed at dawn, holding a long piece of string leading from the trap into his hut. When a baboon crept into the cage to steal the mealies, Matthias would yank the string hard, pulling the cage down off the bricks. Amazingly, this worked, At 5 the following morning, an excited Fiona, our housekeeper, arrived, panting at my parents' bedroom door, to tell them that Matthias had caught a big baboon. Mum was delighted, and waking Dad said, "Go and shoot it." Grumpily he put on his dressing gown and sheepskin flying boots, left over from the Second World War, loaded the 12-bore and trudged up to Matthias's hut on the hill behind our homestead. There he found a crowd of interested Zulu farmhands gathered around the trap. A terrified baboon cowered in the corner, shivering with fright, its paws clamped over its face. Out of word, Dad lifted the corner of the trap, shoved the baboon out with his foot, and, as it raced over the horizon to freedom, he raised the gun and fired both barrels into the sky. Then he turned to his staff and put his finger to his lips. Nobody would tell. This was a vendetta between Mum and the baboons. He had no quarrel with them. Then he went back to bed, saying curtly to Mum, "I've done it. Don't ever ask me to shoot a trapped baboon first thing in the morning again. If you want them dead, you must shoot them yourself." For several years the trap lay unused, but when Mum started to have further baboon trouble, she and Matthias resurrected the trap and set it up again. By this time, in the late 1970s, we were all married and were living in various parts of the country, raising our own children. Often at weekends, we came up to the farm to spend time with Mum and Dad and indulge our sons in their favourite pursuit, trout fishing. It was late on a warm Saturday afternoon, and our entire family was up at the lake fishing. John, married to my older sister Diana, was by himself in the house watching a rugby match on television. He was disturbed by a small, noisy group of farm workers banging on the kitchen door and all trying to tell him something. John grew up in Johannesburg and is a townie. He can't speak a word of Zulu, but was told by Fiona in her own few words of halting English that Matthias had caught a baboon in the trap and he must come and shoot it. John knew the guns were all locked away in the gun safe, but he had no idea where the key was kept. Then he remembered the old Boer story about painting a baboon white and letting it go. So he asked Fiona in sign language whether there was any white paint in the house. After a long hunt through Mum's storeroom, she eventually reappeared triumphantly, holding an aerosol can of silver spray paint, which we'd used to decorate fir cones at Christmas time. John is a chartered accountant, a tall, fastidious man with a gentle soul and impeccable manners, much loved by our family. He's always willing to please, especially Mum. So, followed by an excited, chattering entourage of the entire farm labour force of about 40 Zulu men and women and a large number of whooping, jumping children, John ran up to the hill to the trap. Shaking the can vigorously, he advanced on the cowering baboon and proceeded to start spraying the animal with silver paint. Understandably, the baboon took fright and ran round and round the wire cage, trying to escape the terrifying hiss and spray coming from the can. John had to run round and round as well, attempting short bursts from the nozzle, at intervals. There was silver paint everywhere. Every time he managed to get a direct jet onto the animal, it shook itself vigorously, splattering him and the cage with paint. The terrified baboon also lost control of its bowels, and its loose, stinking dung became mixed in with the silver paint. Eventually, the can ran dry. Panting but triumphant, John stood back to admire his handiwork. There was some silver paint on its fur. Most of it covered John and the cage. He told the onlookers to lift the cage to release the baboon, which took off its speed, stopping only to pick clumps of silver dung off its coat and flick it to the ground. By the time it reached the brow of the hill, it was almost clean again. John, holding the empty can, had to trudge, defeated, back to the house for a turpentine clean-up and a long bath. The Minkie. In 1985, my ex-husband George, as manager of a small branch of Barclays Bank in Pietermaritzburg, was approached by the curator of the Natural History Museum for an overdraft in order to fund some very necessary renovations to their exhibits, some of which had been on display since the turn of the century. As a child, I'd loved visiting the museum, and once or twice Dad had taken us as small girls. Overawed and clutching his hand tightly, we'd gaze at the live, writhing, venomous snakes in their glass case in the foyer, and crane our necks to stare up at the massive, lifelike, stuffed bull elephant, which took up the entire floor space of the main hall. The curator offered George a tour of the museum, including a look behind the scenes at their taxidermy workshop to show how the money he intended to borrow would be spent. When George mentioned this visit, I asked if I could come along too and bring our two boys who were on holiday from school. On the day, George wasn't able to get away from the office, so the boys and I spent an interesting morning seeing how the exhibits were prepared and displayed. Just before we were about to be ushered out of the workshop for a cup of tea, I saw the foot of a primate sticking out from under a workbench. Interested, I asked the curator what it was, and he told me they were about to throw it out. It was an adult orangutan and well past its best. It had been on display for 70 years. Some of the orange fur was starting to fall out. It was looking a bit mangy. The museum had applied for a new specimen from the Far East, and they were going to renovate the display niche with its painted jungle-like surroundings, putting the new ape in place of this one. I was suddenly struck with an idea. On the spur of the moment, I asked, if they were going to throw it away, could I have it? Surprised, the curator said, yes, of course. We pulled it out, brushed the sawdust off it, and I had a better look at my new acquisition. Frozen in a half crouch, with its long arms dangling, it stood at about 4.5 feet high and had a rather distant gaze to its soulful brown glass eyes. It was too big for us to carry, so the curator arranged to have it sent over to the bank later that afternoon. As promised, the orangutan was delivered by a Zulu messenger, and since George was still out, the bank staff seated it in his chair behind the huge desk in the manager's office. Apparently was more than astonished to find it sitting there when he arrived back, and being a good sport, he put it in the front passenger seat of his car, the seat belt strapped over its shoulder, and drove home. I wrapped it up as best as I could with coloured birthday paper, wrote a card, and, as it was Mum's birthday the following Saturday, my boys and I took it up to the farm to present her with it. Excuse me. She was thrilled with her gift. She called it the Minky, after a Pink Panther movie she'd seen on television, in which Peter Sellers, as Inspector Clouseau, had it chastised an organ grinder in the street, saying, as he scraped dung off his shoe onto the cobbles, "Get your filthy Minky off the street." Mum got old Jormela, who worked in the garden, to put up a sturdy pole in the middle of the veggie patch, and between them they mounted this large stuffed ape upright and crouching realistically. Word got around the farm immediately, and all the workers, men, women and children, came to have a look at it. One by one they arrived to stare at this creature and speculate, with a lot of tongue clicks and shaking of heads. They knew our resident baboons as well, and also the smaller vervet monkeys and the shyer Somango monkeys, which lived in the depths of the forest. One young man said confidently that he'd seen this thing before, and he knew what it was. Intrigued, Dad asked him in Zulu where he'd seen an orangutan. "At the circus," was the reply. Once a year the Boswell Wilkie Circus came to Nottingham Road by rail, and the entire district went to a show in the big marquee. Every farmer, including Dad, sent all his labourers and house staff by tractor and trailer, and we'd go with our parents in the car. One year there'd been some chimps which rode bicycles and walked on a tightrope. This youngster had remembered seeing the chimps and was convinced that this new creature was one of them. His status rose as he told the others how this ape could ride a bicycle, and I noticed some of the young girls stealing admiring glances at him. He puffed out his chest with pride and started to strut a little. Eventually the novelty wore off, the labourers went back to work, and the Minky kept solitary vigil in the veggie garden. Not a single baboon went near that garden for the next 5 years. Mum was delighted, and every time I spoke to her on the phone, she crowed happily about the success of my birthday present to her. She was able to plant mealies, pumpkins, and even raspberries, something she'd never been able to do before the Minky arrived. She looked after it carefully. In the summer, if a thunderstorm threatened, she sent Jormela running to cover the Minky with a plastic fertilizer bag. During the short, dry winter season, when nothing was growing for the baboons to raid, it had a place in the corner of the cool, thatched dairy, where it was kept safe, carefully wrapped in a sack. Mum even sprinkled the interior of the sack with Ratex poison pellets, in case it was nibbled by rodents. In early spring, Mum and Jormela would pull the monkey out again, the Minky, out again, brush it down, and reinstate it on the pole. Now and again, a seam would split and some of the sawdust stuffing would start to ooze out. Mum painstakingly stitched it back up as one would a tattered old teddy bear, mending the rips with a big curved needle and baling twine left over from sewing up wool bales in the days when Dad had the Basotho shearing gang in to shear our sheep and ship the wool to Durban. Mum loved to entertain. She'd have friends to stay, lunch and tennis parties, and even once a year a visit from the local garden club. As every visitor or family member replaced their teacups on the saucers after having arrived, Mum would drag them off to the veggie garden to admire her minkie. One summer afternoon there was a tremendous thunderstorm. Hailstones the size of golf balls came hurtling out of the sky, and in spite of its waterproof cover, the minkie's head was knocked right off by a big hailstone and fell to the ground. Mum was devastated and tried everything she could to reattach the head. Nothing worked. So sadly she stuck the severed head on an upright post at the gate and walked forlornly back to the house. The following morning at first light, the entire troop of baboons crept silently into the veggie patch and stripped it bare. And that's all for this week. Photographs can be found on my website, www.whitezulubook.com. Thank you to John Moslane, who, without him, I could not make these videos. He does an excellent job of being my sound engineer, as I call him. Thank you so much for listening to this, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.